Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to focus on this kind of a newish paper. That's joint work with a couple of my longstanding co-authors, Tanya Babina and Alex Hay at the University of Maryland and James Hudson at the AI for Good Foundation. So I think we have an hour, so I'm going to do 40 minutes or so of a talk and then questions. But please also ask questions throughout. So it's very much open. I don't want everybody to forget what their questions were by the time that I'm done talking. I'm definitely used to being interrupted and totally fine with it. So this paper is kind of, I guess, one in a series of papers that Tanya, Alex, and James have together. That started a few years back. So actually during COVID, we started working with these resume data, looking at kind of what happens when firms invest in skilled human capital, start hiring people who are technically skilled. Not even thinking about AI back then. James and I have a paper called Trading on Talent in the Review of Finance, where we look at just kind of general technical skills, what happens when firms sort of hire data scientists or IT professionals and so on. And then we thought, well, there's this new technology that's coming up. And at that point, it was still kind of very new for economics research. So maybe not actually, like firms have been using AI for some time, but we were among kind of the first that I guess thought about looking at what happens when firms use AI. And so this kind of builds on that early work. And by now we know a couple of things. In our first paper, we took a look at what happens to the firm's sort of sales and kind of scale, right? So revenues, what happens when they start using AI? Are they able to actually harness that for greater growth? And the answer is yes. So firms that invest more in AI, they do grow more in terms of their revenues, their market share, their market valuations, but also in terms of their employment. So we kind of saw the surprising effect because people even back then thought that, oh, well, maybe our AI is going to replace human labor. It's like, no, actually, to date, it doesn't. So at least in that first wave. And of course, all of this is sort of pre-generative AI, but we think that the patterns generalized because the main application of AI that we saw in that early work was that it's actually helping firms innovate more. So they can explore faster, they can experiment faster, they can produce more new products. And as a result, they're able to grow by producing these new additional products and hiring more product managers and other type of support roles to actually scale up rather than immediately sort of replacing labor or enhancing productivity. Of course, there are some sectors where productivity enhancements are the main sort of effect of AI. I have a paper with other co-authors in accounting, which is in an accounting journal, Review of Accounting Studies, that looks at what happens when audit firms invest in AI. Now, audit is the type of sector that is sort of perfect for being automated by AI because it's all about prediction, anomaly detection. There's not that much new product creation you can do. It's a very standardized sector. And there we do see that, well, the first effect of AI is to improve the audit process, so to do a better job auditing. But the second effect is that you do have actually some reduction in the number of auditors that you need. If they can do a better job, maybe you need fewer people to do it. And Tanya, Alex, and James and I also have a paper that looks more like purely labor paper, looks at the composition of the workforce, what happens in terms of okay, firms hire more workers, not fewer with AI, but maybe they're different types of workers. And yes, they are. They tend to be more educated, more technical, and also kind of more young and independent. So middle management is something that you need a little less of with AI. In this paper, we kind of go beyond these. Let's click. Yeah, okay, now it does. Great. So we go beyond these kind of first moment effects, right? So the first moment we know that for AI has benefited firms from our work, from others' work. In this paper, we're going to want to go and look at the second moment. Like, okay, well, generally it's positive, firms benefit, but what happens to their risk? And of course, risk, especially when it relates to AI, comes in many forms. There's a lot of discussion about sort of risk of the labor force, existential risk, all sorts of risks from AI. Here in this paper, we take a very finance perspective. We mean a very specific thing when we say risk. We mean firm systematic risk. So basically, how do the returns of the firms co-vary with the rest of the market? Because if they're co-varying a lot, then that means that investors actually take on more systematic risk investing in these AI kind of doing firms. And to us, at least, it was not ex ante evident which way the effect would go. We could actually think about reasons why AI investments by firms might either increase or decrease their systematic risk. So on the one hand, AI, of course, enables firms to do better forecasting. And better forecasting might mitigate certain types of especially tail risks or market downturns risk. Firms can forecast that better. They're not going to overproduce right when demand is low, and so they can kind of shield themselves from some of the downside. So that might be one reason they will have a reduction in their systematic risk. Also, in our previous papers, of course, we found that firms, when they invest in AI, they become bigger, they grow more, become more dominant players. And empirically, there is this negative correlation between firm size and beta, right? Market beta, their kind of systematic risk component. And so mechanically, it might be the case that as firms invest in AI and they become bigger, their betas will also go down. So those are some of the reasons we might see a reduction in systematic risk as firms invest in AI. On the other hand, there are also some reasons that we might actually see an increase in systematic risk when firms invest in AI. One is that, well, how do they invest? Right? If all the firms are investing in AI, sort of doing similar things, right? They're using similar methods, maybe similar data sets, similar third-party dependencies, right? Purchasing similar solutions from providers, all kind of using, I guess the latest example would be OpenAI's technology, but before this, in our sample period, something like IBM Watson, right? So kind of everybody jumping on the same bandwagon. That might make the firms more correlated with each other. And that can lead to greater systematic risk for these AI investing firms because they're all sort of doing the same thing. Might also be that investors are all doing the same thing. So if all the institutional investors especially might get excited about AI and they're all kind of pouring capital into these AI investing firms at the same time. The capital goes in at the same time, the capital comes out at the same time. Again, that can induce a correlation between these AI investing firms that will make them more systematically risky because if they're more correlated with each other. That will also lead to an increase in firm level beta. And then finally, what we saw in our prior work is that the main channel through which artificial intelligence enables firm growth for most industries, so not thinking audit, but thinking just random industries, manufacturing, construction, firms that are using AI just in their regular day-to-day operations, pharmaceuticals, a lot of it is basically that it enables innovation, that these firms are producing new products that they wouldn't be able to produce before. Caterpillar, which is a company that produces tractors, might now produce smart machinery with some computer vision components. Pharmaceutical companies might produce drugs faster. There's the example of Moderna leadership saying that without prediction technology like machine learning and AI, it would have taken years to develop the COVID vaccine. With these predictive technologies, it was a matter of months. You can have come up with new products faster. So we've seen this in the past, that AI enables innovation. Well, if that's the case, innovation is something that might actually be quite pro-cyclical. So if you're able to come up with new products, that's something that's going to be more valuable in market upturns when there's a lot of demand for your new products than in market downturns when consumers don't have that much extra spending capacity and they're not going to be buying your new products. So this can actually also induce a positive sort of relationship between AI investments and systematic risk of the firms, because those AI investments in terms of innovation are going to especially pay off in good market conditions, not so much in bad market conditions. So as a spoiler, we see empirically the results land on the second part. So actually, empirically, we observe that firms, as they invest in artificial intelligence, experience an increase in their systematic risk. And then I'm going to show you various additional results for sort of why, and we try to really get at these different mechanisms and show that it's more consistent with some of them than others. And then really the one that we think is going on is this very last bullet point. That basically artificial intelligence is creating growth options for firms, creating opportunities that then become kind of exercised or valuable during good market conditions. And that's why firms become more pro-cyclical as they invest in AI. So I'm going to dwell a little bit more on this last mechanism before I go and show you all of the empirical results. So as I mentioned, we already documented in the past in our 2024 JFE paper that AI enables growth through product innovation. Growth options in the past have often been modeled as being sort of riskier than assets in place. So firm beta can kind of increase as growth options become more in the money, especially. So as they become closer to realization, once they're realized, so once you're kind of done in terms of actually manifesting your growth, then the beta will come back down. But I think we're still pretty far from that, especially in the time period that we've looked at it in our work with AI. But what are the predictions? The predictions from this mechanism, and I'm going to kind of show you the evidence for most of them, is that as the firms invest in AI, they're loading up on growth options. So they're basically investing in future opportunities to invest and produce something. So their betas go up due to this product innovation channel. AI investing firms will therefore also become more growth-like. So they're going to start looking more like growth firms than like value firms because they're loading up on these growth opportunities rather than on kind of assets in place. So we expect to see a decreasing loading on the value factor, on the HML factor. So beyond just the market beta effects, we also have some predictions for the other factors. This increase in market beta should be especially pronounced in good market conditions when the growth options become more in the money. So as you kind of become closer to potentially realizing the growth options, the convexity rate of the option is such that that's when the firms are going to especially correlate with the firm's returns with the market returns. And then, and this is kind of the one prediction that we don't have really evidence for, but it's something I think it's still a ways off in the future, that eventually investing firms will drop once they've actually realized all of those growth opportunities. But I think we're still in the investment stage, to be honest. Even now, our sample period right now in the paper ends in 2018. We've now kind of almost finalized all the tables to extend that to 2023 with generative AI. The picture still looks the same. We're still in that upswing and kind of investment stage. I don't think we're getting close to the to sort of being at the beta drop because all the options have been realized yet. All right, previewing the results. Yes. Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. Just for my understanding, how do you measure AI investment? Is it like the disclosure?
I'll get there in a couple of slides, so bear with me. Yes. I think it'd probably be like the slide after the results on the overview. So I've already previewed actually the first two bullet points here. The main result that firms, as they invest in AI, experience an increase in their market beta, and that this seems to be consistent with the growth options framework. So we do observe that their loadings on the value factor go down, so they become more growth-like, and that the increase in the market beta is larger in market upswings than market downswings. We also do a bunch of, this is one of those papers that we have a theory or a mechanism in mind, and we do some tests in favor of that mechanism, but then we also do a lot of tests sort of ruling out alternatives. Various people have different favored alternatives, including us. Like we thought that the investor capital co-movement channel was really interesting. We're just not seeing it in the data. So we don't see well, first we rule out mechanical things like firms just become bigger and so they're a bigger part of the market or bigger part of their own industry, or they just become like tech firms. So I'm going to show you kind of all of those things, slicing by industry and looking at different industry betas and so on. But we also interestingly don't see the other kind of mechanisms that I listed on my, it was like second slide in terms of what might cause increases in beta. We don't see kind of evidence that would be consistent with either the kind of firms all relying on the same sort of tools or investor capital moving. Why? Because when we exclude AI investing firms from the index, we still find the same results. So basically, it's not that AI investing firms are becoming more correlated with other AI investing firms, it's that they're really becoming more correlated with everything in the market kind of more or less equally. So depending on the time, I might show you some of those, but sort of go through and kind of rule out various other alternatives. So overall, what we see is that AI adoption is kind of associated with this increase in systematic risk, but it's sort of not necessarily such a bad thing. It actually just inflects, not a bad thing at all. It just reflects the fact that artificial intelligence is a type of technology that allows firms to sort of innovate in the future. So it's not in itself the end goal. It's kind of, it opens doors. You invest in AI, and then you're able to invest further in actually productizing some of those ideas that are going to come out of your AI. All right, so I'm going to answer your question first with the data and measures, and then I'm going to show you all of the detailed empirical results, sort of the main ones and the mechanisms, and probably will not get to other kind of points 4 and 5 necessarily, but they're less cool. All right, so how do we measure AI investments? And the answer is that firms don't disclose it. At the time, like by the time that firms would talk about AI, for example, in their 10Ks, it's usually like well past the time that they did any kind of investments, like years later that they actually start talking about it, not when they're actually investing. So it is a challenge. And how did we overcome this challenge? Well, we actually, I guess, did it in our previous paper. So the measure and the data kind of come from our prior work. And we said, well, what do you need to be able to implement AI? You need data. That's something that firms are going to differ in ex ante, and that's something that's not going to change that much. Like Amazon is just going to have more data than a new, right, a firm that just opened yesterday. The larger firms will have more data and so on. It's not something you can readily invest in because if you go and buy Amazon's data, it's not the same as being Amazon and having it internally. Like the comparative advantage kind of erodes. So that's not going to be something that kind of necessarily we can measure or that will sort of change that much over time. You need computing resources. Now, over our sample period and like to the 2010s, that was less important. It's a little bit more important now. But again, that's something that necessarily firms disclose. I think the closest that I've seen in terms of automation, not AI necessarily, but automation would be something like electricity use, which again might be more relevant now, not so relevant in the years that, and the most of that decade that AI has been popular. The other thing is like you need the actual skill to be able to implement an AI model. Even if you're not going to yourself come up with all of the methods, you need somebody who's going to be competent enough to apply it to your data and to run it on your like, grid and so on. And so what we look at is the human capital, is looking at whether firms hire anybody who is actually skilled in AI. And these are really rare people. So like the AI employees that we're going to be finding in this data set are about as common as patent holding inventors. So it's not just like everybody who says that they can learn some Python. Like, we really are identifying a pretty special group. So we also take a look at external AI use, so external tools, for example. And in this sample period, it would be something like IBM Watson, PeopleSoft Amelia, that were kind of tools around. Typically, what happens when firms use external tools, they still hire somebody internally because you need somebody to be able to adapt that tool to your setting. So for example, GlaxoSmithKline, which is a pharmaceutical company, they partnered with IBM. They use IBM Watson. In the year that that partnership was announced, that was also the year that they actually hired some internal AI specialists. So we can incorporate the external tools. It makes some of the results stronger. It does not qualitatively change them because it's highly correlated with the internal AI talent because you need somebody internal to use external tools as well. All right, now that we've arrived at this kind of conceptual idea of measuring AI investments by looking at whether firms hire anybody who actually knows anything about AI, we need to actually observe that, right? How do you tell whom firms are hiring? Well, we use these data sets on basically resumes. So think LinkedIn profiles and similar type of resumes that people might be submitting somewhere online or have on their websites, and job postings. So the resumes come from Cognism, which is a UK-based firm aggregating information on firms and employees. And the job postings come from Burning Glass, which has now been renamed Lightcast, which is a fairly standard data set of job postings. Really good coverage rates as far as what coverage rates you can generally get for the US workforce. So Cognism covers about 64% of US employees by the end of our sample in 2018, and about 50% or so in 2010. For comparison, the only kind of data that you can get to actually get sort of official data on US employees would be the US Census. My co-author Tanya has worked with the US Census. And at best, the coverage rates that she's gotten with US Census were also in the 60%. Why? Because you're never going to get all states in US Census. Some states just like don't ever provide their data for research. New York, for example, is one of those. Some, like California, rarely do. And so you're never going to get 100% coverage. In the US, it's not Scandinavia, unfortunately. So 64% coverage of the US workforce is about as good as kind of anybody's ever gotten. So very comprehensive. Especially, I guess, if anything, more so for the more educated workforce that's more likely to have, say, a LinkedIn profile or resume online. So we are fairly confident we're going to capture the AI workers at these firms. What do we see for people? We see their job histories, their education histories, and anything else they might put in a resume. So they might put, like, they have a publication, they might put that on a resume. They won some award, they might put it on there. If they have some skills and so on. The job postings from Lightcast, also pretty comprehensive coverage in the 60 to 70%. It basically covers all of the online job postings in the US, which is the majority. Majority of job postings do get made online these days. The advantages of using the resume data relative to just the job posting data are a couple. Well, first, we actually get to observe, right, the real people there. It does have good coverage. Capturing actual hiring rather than just whom firms kind of list job postings for comes with a couple of advantages. For example, for something like AI, it might be that a company is not actually going out and hiring individual people. Maybe they just go and buy, like Equihire, a little startup that does AI, to basically get the specialists. I've definitely seen cases where a team would have no product, nothing really, would get purchased by a company that basically just wants access to those ex-Google or Stanford faculty or whatever, people who are founding the startup. Not the startup itself, they're literally hiring the people. That's something that you would not see in job postings, right? You'll never have an actual job advertisement for those. But you would see that in the resumes. Why? Because those people's resumes will then say that they went and worked for whichever firm hired their startup afterwards. So that's something we can capture. The other thing with job postings, of course, is that they might not say how many people they're hiring, right? There might be one job posting, but they're actually hiring like 100 software engineers. Again, something that we will see in the resume data. In reality, in practice, those things are actually pretty minor. So in the paper, we have all of the tables. We do them with the job postings and with the resumes, and the results are identical. I'm going to show you the results with the resumes today, but they're the same if you use the job posting. So in practice, those kind of caveats are actually pretty minor, and using job postings is good enough. And that's something that we think is also valuable because some other research teams have ready access to the job postings and not the resumes, and then they're sort of, they're just fine using the job postings in practice. All right. How do we actually identify the AI workers? So we start with the job postings to search for the terms that are sort of most relevant for AI jobs. So the nice thing about the job postings, so even though we have the resume data, we still use them, is that they kind of are all tagged with sort of what are the necessary skills, right? You have a job posting and then it's like communication skills or whatever kind of requirements for the job. And so what we do is we don't want to kind of pre-specify what we define as AI relevant or not AI relevant. We want to let the data speak for itself. And so the data can tell us what skills are really the most AI relevant ones. So we start with just the terms artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. So basically AI, and then the three kind of main areas of commercial use of AI. And then for every skill in the job postings data, we take a look at all of the job postings that require that skill. What percentage of them will explicitly mention one of the core AI areas? So for example, deep learning is obviously an AI-related term. So 86% of all job postings that will mention deep learning will also explicitly mention machine learning or computer vision, whatever. Information retrieval is something that may be relevant to AI, but it's not AI specific. So out of all of the job postings that will have information retrieval, 37% of them will explicitly refer to AI, machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. And then, of course, communication skills, like, occasionally you might see communication skills there side by side by machine learning. But the vast majority of the many job postings listing communication skills, like 99.7%, will, of course, not mention anything related to AI. So we do this for every skill in the job postings data. There are tens of thousands of these skills. And we identify the ones that are kind of the highest rated. Empirically, which are the ones that seem to be kind of relevant to AI and specific to AI. So it's not kind of information retrieval, it may be relevant, but it's not specific. There are also lots of jobs and information retrieval that are not about AI. Deep learning is sort of what we're after. It's relevant to AI and it's really specific to AI. Once we identify those terms, then we can search for them in people's resumes. Where do we search in the resumes? Well, the most obvious place is the job title. So if somebody's job title is senior machine learning developer, then we can readily know that they're doing AI. They're doing machine learning. Now, oftentimes the job title will be something pretty generic. It might just be senior software engineer. And then which of the many senior software engineers are doing any machine learning or AI? Then we look further. We look at the job description. The job description is talking about TensorFlow. Okay, yeah, they're doing AI. The other thing we look at are publications, patents, and awards. So maybe your job title is just senior software engineer, and you're not really writing that much about exactly what you're doing, but we see that you're publishing on neural networks, or you have a patent on some deep learning method. It's like, yeah, you're definitely doing AI. And we give a little bit of leeway there in terms of like, if a publication comes like within a year of you leaving that job, we still think that job was AI related, because sometimes it takes some time to get published, even in computer science, which is still faster than finance. And then once we identify every AI related employee, then we aggregate it up to the firm level by looking at the percentage of employees in each firm in each year that we label as AI related. As I mentioned, this is quite low. This is like as large as the percentage of employees who hold patents. So this is pretty specialized labor. And of course, that's not kind of, when people ask, oh, so like a firm hiring just one AI worker will make it like grow tremendously and have all these benefits? Like, no. Hiring this AI worker is an indication that you're starting to use these methods. But there are a lot of other investments that are going to go on with that, including investments in productization teams and so on to actually make use, right, of the growth options that you're creating. But this is an indication for creating those growth options in the first place. All right, let me show you the main results. So the first kind of main specification that we look at is just the full sample period. So right now from 2010, 2018, but as I mentioned, we're updating the paper with up to 2023. The results are similar, just I guess a little bit bigger. Is we just look at the changes in the firm level beta from the starting point, so from 2010 to the ending point. And we correlate that, we regress that against the changes in the firm's AI workers, basically, their AI investment, the change in the share of workers who are doing AI at the firm. Control, of course, for all sorts of firm characteristics, as well as location characteristics, so kind of how skilled is the population, the firm's headquarters, industry fixed effects, and so on. We do restrict the sample in a couple of ways. First of all, we exclude the tech sectors. So we're really not here talking about NVIDIA making chips or anything. We're not talking about firms that maybe are producing technology that will be helpful for AI. We're talking about Moderna using AI to come up with the COVID vaccine, or Caterpillar using AI to come up with that tractor with the special sensors, or self-driving cars, right? Like, we're talking about firms that are using AI for their own kind of typical business operations. So we exclude next 51 and 54 sectors. We also, of course, require firms to have a certain level of coverage. One, of having like enough employees to begin with, and two, having enough employees that we actually get to observe the resumes for. So there is, I think, 50 resumes, the minimum that we need to observe for the firm. Because if we don't see enough employees, then how are we going to get this share of AI workers at the firm? So that does restrict the sample quite a bit. We have just under 1,000 firms that sort of satisfy all of these conditions. And of course, they have to exist in both the beginning and the end of the sample, so we can take a look at the changes in their beta from the beginning to the end. So these are the results. We look at the CAPM beta as well as the market beta from the 4-factor model. Same if we look at the 6-factor model, so it doesn't really matter what factors we throw in terms of the effect on the market beta. The effect on the market beta is that a 1 standard deviation increase in AI investments is associated with a 0.05 increase in firm level beta, measured with either the CAPM or the 4-factor or the 6-factor, whichever model you prefer. And as I mentioned, this is not a result that is driven mechanically by, for example, AI investing firms becoming tech firms. You're like, okay, well, they invested in AI, but they basically stopped producing tractors. They became kind of tech firms. And the tech sector maybe is high beta, and that's why they're looking like they're high beta. That's not the case. It's also not the case that, oh, well, these firms just became bigger, and so they're a bigger player in their own industry. And of course, that means that they kind of are a bigger share of the market, and so they correlate with the market more. We decompose our effects of kind of market level beta into looking at the changes in the beta to the tech sector. Those are the first 2 columns. The changes in the firm level beta to their own sector, the next 2 columns. And then the changes in the beta to all other sectors. So this is now excluding the tech sector and excluding your own sector. And what we see is that the results are pretty much the same. 0.05 increase in the beta to the tech sector, 0.04 to your own industry, 0.05 to the other sectors. It's the same. So it's not that they're becoming more correlated with some specific sector. They're becoming more correlated also with other random sectors that are neither their own nor the tech sector. That's kind of the first thing that we sort of rule out, is this mechanical industry explanation. Yes.
Is this on per year level?
So this right now is looking at, so it's cross-sectional, at the differences from the first year to the last year. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's at the firm level, so that's why the number of observations is just under 1,000. This is how many firms satisfy those criteria to be in the sample. We also took a look at whether this is something that we see with other technologies. And this is a hard question, honestly, in terms of conceptually. So empirically, the answer is no. So if you look at the same specification, the same time period, and instead of putting in AI there, put in this is IT, get kind of insignificant negative, whatever, null results. If we put robotics, insignificant positive. If we put R&D investments, also insignificant small. If we put intangible capital, so Andrea Eisfeld and co-authors, their measure, same thing. So sort of we have not yet kind of found another measure where we would see this type of effect. Now, does this mean that I think that it's only AI that sort of is correlated with increases in beta? Honestly, no. I think that what we are getting at is a broader mechanism. We're getting at certain types of technologies that instead of just like automating things, right, kind of automating a factory like an industrial robot in the Industrial Revolution would not be in that set. But certain types of technologies kind of enable you to come up with new products to innovate faster. And those types of technologies will have this type of effect. Will have an effect that firms become more systematically risky because they're loading up on growth options. We don't see empirically this happen with IT, I think because we're looking at the wrong time period. IT, this was like 2010s. That's not when by the time of 2010s, IT is an automation technology. It's not really creating new opportunities. Maybe if you look at 2000s, maybe we would, but that's something that actually with the resume data, the further back you go, the fewer people you have in the data. So if you go to 2000, you only have 25% coverage. It's maybe not that good of a data set for measuring those investments. For robotics, well, that's more of an automation technology than an innovation technology. For R&D, which I don't have in the slides here, but I have it in the paper, R&D is both R&D, right? And the ARP component should have similar effects to what we're observing with AI, that is like really research and maybe coming up with new opportunities. But the D is basically the realization of those growth options. It's the development is already kind of past the loading up an option stage. So I don't think the measure is precise enough to capture. So it's not necessarily that I think that the results are unique to AI. I just think that over this time period, AI was the kind of technology that we saw, right? This kind of starting to be used in creating growth options and creating those opportunities for firms in a way that empirically really lets us get at some of these, I think, really interesting effects of technology that are not kind of how we necessarily always think about technology. The most common way to model technology is just like increase the A in the productive function, increase your productivity, and that's all. So that's a little caveat. A little bit on the time series. So yeah, the main results are looking at the full kind of from 2010 onwards. We can also look year by year. So a bit to your question. And the effects are in the more recent years, which makes sense. So commercial use of AI really started in around 2012 with the ImageNet challenge, or the first wave kind of being able to leverage computing power to do things well. And then it kind of really picked up from 2015. As I mentioned, we extend this to 2023. We see some more some further increase, but not necessarily some kind of like super sharp exponential takeoff in 2022, by the way. Just kind of imagine continuing this trend, basically. We do not yet see any approach of kind of that hump of starting to see declines in beta, though. So we're still, I think, in the option creation phase. All right, I have, I guess, 8 minutes before the self-designated questions. So let me show you some additional results on the mechanism that we think is at play, which is that artificial intelligence enables firms to innovate more, and that's why we see this systematic risk. So there are a couple of additional predictions that I outlined from this mechanism at the very beginning, right? The first one of those was that we should also see some action in other factors, specifically the value factor, right? If firms that invest in AI are loading up on growth options, then they're becoming more like growth firms and less like value firms. So I showed you the market data from the 4-factor model, but I haven't actually shown you the other factors yet. So here they are. There's nothing really on the size. There's, if anything, actually maybe a negative relationship with momentum. And then there's a strong negative relationship with the HML factor, which is the high minus low, so value factor. This makes sense. So basically, firms that invest in AI, they become less value-like. Let's take a look separately on the H and L, so the high and the low value stocks. And we see action on both sides. So AI investments, firms that invest in AI become less correlated with value firms. This is the value portfolio. They also become more correlated with the growth portfolio. So, and we see some of that effect on both sides. All right, that's the first additional prediction. And then we also had another additional prediction, which is that as the growth options become more in the money, so sort of market conditions are especially good, that's when we should see an especially pronounced effect. And so what we do is we split the days in the year, so both in the starting year, 2010, and the ending year, into two subsets. The days with above median and the days with below median returns. So these are kind of the better market days and the worse market days. And then we compute betas separately on these two subsamples. Compute the beta in 2010 on sort of the good days, and we compute the beta in 2010 on the bad days. And we do the same for 2018 beta on the good days, beta on the bad days. Differences between them, so differences between the upside beta from 2010, 2018, and differences in the downside beta. And let's take a look. So both of them go up. Upside beta, one standard deviation increase in AI investments is associated with a 0.08 increase in upside beta. One standard deviation in AI investments is associated with a 0.04 increase in downside beta. Both of those are positive, both of those are significant. So you see beta increase everywhere, but more so on the upside than the downside, consistent with what we sort of expected conceptually. And that difference also is significant. So AI investments make firms co-move with the market more, especially so when the market is doing well. That's when sort of the likelihood of realizing all of those additional product options and so on becomes relatively more likely. All right, in terms of alternatives, as I mentioned, there is one that I think is especially interesting. So that's the one that I'm gonna click into and skip over the others. I'm not sure if I can click into things. That's the, or maybe there's like a pointer that I can use to click. I don't think that works. Ah, okay. But how do I go to the second scroll? Ah, thank you. Okay, super. Okay. So this is the one that I wanted to look at, because to us, that was the most natural alternative, was that firms were just kind of all doing the same stuff, or maybe investors were all getting excited about the same firms at the same time, and that's creating co-movement. But that empirically doesn't seem to be going on for a couple of reasons. First, if we slice the sample by high versus low institutional ownership, we don't get any consistent patterns. So for the CAPM beta, maybe it's the effect is a bit higher in the high institutional ownership subsample. For the for the market beta from the four-factor model, and it was a bit higher in the low institutional ownership subsample, but there isn't really a consistent difference between sort of institutional ownership. And then even more interestingly, what we've done is we've taken a look at what happens if we exclude AI investing firms from the index. And of course, for every firm, we exclude itself from the index already when we compute the beta. But here we exclude all AI investing firms. So we're basically looking kind of how does beta change to a market composed of everybody who's like not doing any AI at all. And here we still see this exact same effect. So we still see that firms that invest in AI more, one standard deviation increase in AI investments is associated with a 0.05 relative increase in market beta. This is the CAPM one. This one is, drop the label, but it's the market beta from the four-factor model to the index of all the other non-AI investing firms. So it's not that those firms are becoming more correlated with each other. They're really becoming more correlated with the rest of the market as well, which we think is inconsistent with either the investor co-movement story or the sort of they're all just using the same methods and that's why they're becoming correlated type story. All right, one last table before I wrap up and let you ask what you're interested in, is taking a look at the rest of the risk profile. So I really focus on this kind of market beta, but some people find it curious to also see what happens to the total risk of these firms. Are they becoming more volatile? The answer is no. So they're actually not becoming more volatile. The idiosyncratic volatility in both models is basically stays flat, insignificant effects. And even more interestingly, the total volatility stays flat. So it's not that these firms are becoming more volatile, they're just loading more on that market component. They're also loading less, remember, on some of the other factors. They're loading less on the value factor, they're loading less on the momentum factor. And sort of like by net, they're not becoming more volatile. They're kind of just, there is a redistribution of that risk to be really kind of co-moving with the market, and more so on the upside days than the downside days, remember, which is another sort of reason that it's not actually a particularly bad thing, right, for the firms to load up on the systematic risk component on the upside. So we don't see increases in total volatility or idiosyncratic volatility. All right, so let me summarize what I've shown you so far. We think kind of this is an interesting question because this is the first paper to look at the risk profile of AI investing firms, rather than what people typically look, including ourselves, which is the first moment, kind of what happens to the returns of those firms, what happens to the revenues of those firms. We already know that all of those things kind of are positively impacted by AI. Here we take a look at what happens to the second moment of returns, and we find that it does increase. So the systematic risk component does increase with AI investments, but that seems to be a pretty specific and relatively benign type of risk increase, which is driven by product innovation. So consistent with what we've seen in the past, those firms are basically becoming more growth-like because they're loading up on growth options. They're picking up more of the market upside because that's when those options become especially valuable. And so overall, we think that the broader takeaway that our paper makes is that technology, if it's the kind of technology that can actually enable creation of new ideas rather than just only pure automation of existing processes, can actually be sort of a first stage investment in a series of investments, right? You invest in this technology first to create the ideas, and then you supplement it with subsequent investments to exercise in the ideas. And this, in that case, technology can actually serve as a creator of growth options, and it does impact both the first moment, so it does make firms kind of more successful and grow more, but also the risk profile of those firms by making them more pro-cyclical and more sort of systematically correlated with the rest of the market. And that's not something kind of an angle that is often considered with technology investments, this risk profile. So we think that that's something that is interesting even beyond just the AI space. But with that, I want to open it up for what you guys found most interesting and what you'd like to talk about in our remaining